Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about SIHH, and naturally the vast majority of you will already have read a number of articles about the releases at this Geneva-based watch fair, and quite frankly, short of having your head stuck in the ground, it's been pretty much impossible to ignore various very important releases over the past week. And at this point the show has come to a close, and so this weekend I'd like to cover both of these major elements of the show, the sports and casual watches, and indeed the dress watches. And of course this show always has a very strong emphasis on dress watches, and so I've tried to include some casual pieces into this video to try and fill it out a bit. But suffice to say that throughout this weekend, today and indeed tomorrow, I'll be releasing these two videos which I hope will cover all of the most important and all of the most eye-catching and eyebrow-raising pieces over the past week. Of course I will have to leave out a number of pieces inevitably, due to the sheer volume of pieces released over the week, but I hope these videos really do capture the most important, or at least the ones which I think will have the most influence in the next year or so. And for that very reason I won't be talking about facelifts, where several new dial colours or case materials are involved. Really I'm looking to new models which offer new aspects to existing models, or entirely new models for consumers to enjoy. And before I begin the video, I would like to point you all in the direction of my Instagram account, which is growing gradually, and I tend to put videos and pictures of watches on there quite regularly. But if you want to catch a slightly different glimpse of the channel, perhaps a more visual glimpse of the channel, then do take a look there. It's at the same name of Arm on the Watch Guy as the channel. Now this first series of watches I'd like to speak about from IWC represents a very, very new direction for the brand, and I think an incredibly important one. Because over the last few years, the pilot's watches from IWC have lost some of their credibility where their movements were concerned, and certainly as their prices have risen, the fact that they stopped using their own movements, then moved to JLC movements, and then moved to Sellita movements, has marked somewhat of a downgrade in terms of the features one could expect, and in terms of the complexity of these pieces. And so I'm thrilled to be able to say that they've updated their line quite comprehensively in both their Top Gun series and Spitfire series for very crisp and modern pieces, and also rather vintage-inspired models with in-house movements and redesigned forms where the case is the dials and the general build is concerned. And to start with this line, I'd like to speak about the Spitfire line, which represents a more vintage appeal and a more standard appeal to these watches, which I think will be more popular. And of course the first to speak about is the most simple, which is the IWC Pilot's Watch Automatic Spitfire Steel, and there is also a bronze version for £500 more. And this is a 39mm entry-level pilot's watch from IWC, and I say entry-level with a certain emphasis, because these are very entry-level by comparison to other pieces from IWC, though by anyone else's standard these are very much luxury models. But IWC for a while has been competing in the £4,000 sort of mark with the likes of Rolex, yet haven't been using their own in-house movements. And so I'm pleased to say that this 39mm by 10.6 to 10.8mm pilot's watch has a new in-house movement. But other than that, it has a 6 ATM water resistance, so it's water resistant really to all intents and purposes, where you're washing your hands, or even if you're washing the dishes or dunking the watch underwater. It shouldn't pose a problem, though it isn't water resistant for swimming. And this is also a true pilot's watch in the sense that it has a soft iron core to protect it from magnetism, as well as low pressure resistance, so if you were in a plane which suddenly decompressed, the crystal wouldn't be ejected, which is an appreciated element and has been seen in Zins as well, and so it's nice to see this sort of technology in IWCs as well. But where the movement is concerned, one sees the caliber 32110, which is an in-house automatic movement with a 72-hour power reserve, and it hasn't lost in frequency either, still running at 4 Hz, or 8 ticks a second. But what's crucially important about these pieces is they hit exactly the same sort of price range as their predecessors with Sellita movements, and so I appreciate that IWC haven't pushed these watches into the sky where prices are concerned, instead of recognised that they need to make this upgrade in the range, and have kept it at the same sort of price range. But in terms of differences between the steel and bronze models, there are a few variations depending upon the version, because the steel version has a central sort of rotating brushing running around the case, with polished bevels as well, and a polished bezel. By contrast, the bronze version is perhaps more matted, with this matte finish throughout, with the titanium case back. And where dials are concerned, these pieces offer a very interesting compromise between vintage IWC pilot's watches and the more modern Mark series of pilot's watch. And so one has those sword hands which are on their modern watches, but with a very delicate second hand as well, and loom at the 4 quadrants of the dial with this more vintage styling of print on a black dial for the steel version, and then a rather curious green dial for the bronze model. And so the price for these two pieces is £4,090 for the steel version and £4,590 for the bronze. Where the chronographs in the Spitfire line are concerned, there has also been an update, because one sees two new versions, one in bronze and one in steel, both with dimensions which are still very reasonable for a chronograph of this type, with a 41mm diameter by 15.3mm thick. And as is the case throughout this Spitfire line, they have a 6 ATM water resistance and also have that soft iron core protection from magnetism, as well as low pressure resistance, which are both very interesting and important components for a pilot's watch, and I can understand being suitable for this sort of piece. And the design is as classic as ever, with those broad lugs, the exposed crown and those rimmed pushers, which give a very, very characteristic look to these pieces, and certainly none of IWC's classic style has been lost. The design of these watches, where dials are concerned, remain very much in line with the collection's design, but also with the vintage sort of feel these watches have. And so one sees aged luminova on these pieces, in addition to the use of these Arabic numerals around the dial, and also full graduations for the seconds, which I rather appreciate, whilst removing graduations for the running seconds, and so one gets this interesting balance of different features. It also does still feature a somewhat cluttered dial, you could say, because of the full chronograph functionality, but I must say I don't view this as a problem, but more as an interesting characteristic these watches have. And of course they also take on those sword hands, which one would normally see on the modern versions and counterparts as well. But really where the changes have come are in the movement, because these have the IWC 69380, a 46-hour in-house movement with a column wheel in terms of its engagement for the chronograph, as well as automatic winding, and it runs at 4 Hz. So one gets all of the accepted benefits and accepted values of Vacheron 7750, such as that configuration on the dial, albeit with the 12 hours of the chronograph swapped with the running seconds. And whilst the use of Vacheron 7750 based movements in these watches is no bad thing, I think seeing this new movement in these pieces adds a certain finesse, especially in the decoration of the movement as well as the mechanisms, which certainly are at development. And so one sees a real progress towards a more competitive watch on the market to which these watches are appealing. And so the price for these pieces is £5,190 for the steel version and £5,690 for the bronze. But perhaps the most interesting piece in this Spitfire line is the new pilot's watch UTC Spitfire edition MJ271. And this limited edition of 271 pieces comes only in bronze at a price of £8,350. And this is a 41mm by 14.2mm model, and so has a very different case to the other versions in the line, with the same 6 ATM pressure resistance and soft iron core. But this only comes in bronze, and it's unique in the sense that it's one of the very, very few watches that IWC have ever made in their pilot's line to include a UTC function. And in this case it uses their in-house caliber 82710, which is an automatic caliber with a 60-hour power reserve, 22 joules running at 4 Hz, and provides this UTC function, so the separate time zone, operating via that disc which you see in the top half of the dial. And this gives a very, very interesting interpretation to the design, and you can see with that little red arrow one's able to measure and read a separate 24-hour time zone. And so as a very interesting alternative to other IWCs on the market, I think this piece in its limited run of 271 pieces will do extremely well. The other IWC line which has been very comprehensively redeveloped is the Top Gun line, which represents a larger size of watch for these pieces, with, as in addition to larger cases, composite materials used like ceramic, for example, or in the case of some of their new versions, this very interesting ceratanium material, which provides some of the characteristics of titanium and ceramic. But since I've spoken about that ceratanium piece already, I'd like to speak about the general line of these pieces, with of course the most commonly seen version, and I imagine one of the more popular ones being the Pilot's Watch Automatic Top Gun. And this 41 by 11.4mm piece represents the larger, more modern counterpart to that Spitfire 3-hand. And so with its 2mm larger case, one also sees a more modern dial with this black matte sort of dial with also matte black hands with white luminova, and these more rounded numerals in this Arabic form running around the edge of the dial. And this piece just represents a more professional looking piece, with the same movement in fact, and in addition to the same specifications where resistance to the elements are concerned, as that Spitfire, and so one does get the updated movement, which is a nice and very welcome change. But of course the most major and most striking element of this piece is the black ceramic case, which gives an extremely scratch resistant and extremely hard material for this to be made out of. And of course the difference between this and steel, or indeed titanium or another metal, is that it won't scratch in the same way, but rather will shatter if dropped. And so this is a trade-off, but I must say I think the design is extremely appealing, and certainly I imagine will be very popular for its price of £5,150. And the final piece I'd like to speak about in this new IWC range is the Chronograph version of the Top Gun. And this has come in two new pieces, with the standard version in black ceramic, in addition to a Mojave desert version, which is a 500-piece model in this sand-coloured ceramic, which gives a very different look to the watch. And the dimensions of this watch are of course larger than the Spitfire models, and so one can see, because it shares that new movement with the Spitfire versions, the subdials are close to the centre of the dial, which I think does add a certain balance to these pieces with their 44.5mm size by 15.4mm thickness. And these also do of course share the same water resistance and resistance to the elements, but I think the detailing on these pieces is more crisp and modern, with these black and white elements with that red for the running seconds, so you can very quickly tell the chronograph functions from the standard timekeeping. And so I think this represents a very interesting new direction for IWC to be taking, and certainly with that desert sand coloured version in 500 pieces, I think they really are showing a new side to this line. And the prices for these chronograph versions are $6,890 for the standard version and $7,450 for the special desert model. Another brand which has done an extremely good job of consolidating its range this year is Panerai. And really it's the Submersible which they've tweaked and which they've created a very coherent line from. Now, previously the Submersible had been underneath the Luminor range, but now exists as a standalone model, and so one no longer sees any sort of Luminor branding on the dial. It is purely the third model in the Panerai range, as the Luminor is the second and the Radiomir is the first. And so one sees a redesigning of this model in both 42 and 47mm sizes. And they've released quite a few limited editions as well, but I won't really be going into these in particular because I don't think they have quite such an impact as the very important and very lasting effects of their more standard range. And the new Panerai, which I think will make the largest difference for most people, is the new Submersible 42mm. And there have been a few 42mm submersibles previously, but they're now creating a full line of these pieces with a new redesigned form and of course with a redesigned dial. And these pieces take on a relatively conservative sizing for Panerai at that 42mm size, and I think will be more easily worn by more people. And these pieces come in stainless steel in their more basic form, though I'll talk about the Carbotech versions which have been released as well in a moment. But these pieces offer a 300m water resistance, a ceramic bezel with that characteristic Egiziano style of insert, where one has the ceramic insert onto which one has these numerals at each quadrant of the bezel, with the Arabic numerals engraved into them on these small islands, if you will, of metal which protrude, and with a luminous pip at 12. And as with these Panerai submersibles of the past, one has different coloured hands, so one has green luminova on the pip on the bezel and also on the minute hand, whilst blue is used throughout the rest, so you can quickly tell those apart. Of course, where the case design is concerned, one keeps a very conservative and traditional Panerai form, with this cushion case with brushed finishes throughout, in addition to this characteristic crown guard, which of course protrudes from the side of the case and covers the crown entirely with a lever to release it, which is a real classic of Panerai, and I think one couldn't have a submersible without it. Then the dial is extremely clean whether you go for the black dial or the grey version, and I'll speak about the dial variations in a moment because I think they are important to this new line. One has a very clean base to the dial, with the date placed at 3, the running seconds placed at 9, and simply no graduations whatsoever in between the 5-minute indices, which is interesting on a dive watch of this style, because normally a professional dive watch would have these aspects, but I feel that in many ways these are unnecessary for this design, as they certainly weren't necessary when they were used for military purposes in the past, and so I don't see why they would add them in today to clutter up a very clean and extremely well-conceived design. And where the configurations of this watch come, one has the classic black version with a matte black base to the dial, sunken seconds at 9 o'clock, with all of these accents in blue, in addition to these steel-coloured hands and a black ceramic bezel. And that's the PAM 008683, sorry. Then if you want to go for something a bit more different, there is an alternative being the PAM 00959, which has a grey dial which looks like shark skin, and is very reminiscent of the model produced from Guillaume Néry in previous months. Of course, this version doesn't feature the chronograph, which is a differentiating feature, but even so, it's clear that they've taken this inspiration and passed it forward to this design. But in addition to that, it has a blue bezel in ceramic, and so you get a more playful alternative, though I must say my favourite still remains the black. Coming in alongside those 42mm submersibles, one sees the Carbotech 42, and this is the PAM 00960, which is essentially the same watch where the case design is concerned, except now completed entirely in Carbotech. And Carbotech is Panerai's proprietary carbon fibre material, which is very light and very strong, thus being ideal really for the purposes of a dive watch. And this really is seen throughout the case, including the bezel and the main case as well as that crown guard, where the case back though is titanium. And the dial is very similar with the same configuration, except now in matte black with these light blue indices in the form of these styles of indices running around the edge of the dial, and also with this light blue applied to the bezel as well. And it should be noted there is still a difference in the coloration of the hands when they glow, but under the standard view of sunlight, one does see them in this pale blue. And the only real difference in terms of design is seen in the hands, which feature this elongated form, and also this edge to their skeletonized area, which I think is extremely fetching and very, very eye-catching. And all of these versions share the same calibre, which is the calibre OP34 or XXXIV. And this is a richement developed movement, which has been developed exclusively for Panerai with a 72-hour power reserve, 23 joules, and running at 4 Hz, and is of course automatic, and I think suits these watches extremely well, and is seen now in all of these 42mm offerings. And so sitting above the $9,500 steel version and the $17,400 Carbotech version in 42mm size comes the $17,900 US dollar 47mm version in form of the PAM 01616, which also shares almost exactly the same specifications as its smaller counterpart, where design and features are concerned. However, it has a different movement, and this is the calibre P9010, which is a fully in-house 72-hour power reserve 4 Hz 31 dual automatic movement, and does represent a step up, if you will, in terms of the hierarchy of Panerai movements, although I must admit I think that neither movement offers anything in any way bad in terms of quality, and certainly they are of equivalent quality. It really is merely a question of case size, whereby one chooses one of the two. But certainly both offer the same power reserve of 72 hours, and really very, very similar specifications. But I think this 47mm version will offer something interesting for those who enjoy larger Panerais, although one other model has come out from Panerai which I think is also of interest. And this piece is the PAM 799, a 47mm watch which incorporates the best of both worlds of some of Panerai's most interesting case technology. Because for its bezel it has a Carbotech bezel, and so you're able to enjoy that technology. But for the case it takes the form of their BMG-TECH 47mm case. And this is a type of chemical glass, if you will, produced from titanium, nickel, aluminium, zirconium and copper. And this forms a very, very scratch-resistant and very hard case, which has these properties that you would expect to see in ceramic, but by contrast to that it has this very metallic appearance, and so one can have it brushed in the same way, and really it's only if you drop this watch that you'll notice the difference, because of course it will shatter rather than cracking and or snapping and bending as steel would. One also has the added difference of being incredibly light, which is a very interesting, quite eerie thing to feel when one handles this piece, which is of such incredibly light weight. And so I think this is a very interesting model because it shares the same internals as that 47mm version of the Carbotech, and so in many ways it's very similar, but I think for $14,900 US dollars it offers a very interesting compromise, but also something for someone who wants to enjoy both styles of Panerai alternative cases in a single model. Moving away from Panerai, I'd like to speak about the Cartier Santos Chronograph, because it's been a year since Cartier released their new Santos, with its new case design and very innovative bracelet and strap changing option. But now they're releasing the Chronograph to match, and this is a rather large watch by contrast with an extra large 43.3 by 51.3 by 12.5mm case, which certainly puts this watch very much in line with a significant and sizable man's watch. It comes in stainless steel with an ADLC blackened bezel, as well as an option for a stainless steel version with a yellow gold bezel and yellow gold screws on the bracelet, or indeed a full rose gold version if you fancy a fully gold model. And these do also come on alligator straps, rubber straps, or indeed on the metal bracelet, depending upon the version. And so one's able to have these very different appearances for the watch, depending upon what you want out of this design and timepiece, but it shares the same squared design with the Santos, as well as the Roman numerals and those traditional lines. The dials are also an interesting play on the standards from Cartier in the Santos collection, because one sees vertical brushing adorning the bottom of the dial, as indeed is the case in the centre of the dial and around the edge of the dial, but in this raised section where one sees those Roman numerals, one sees a sunburst effect as well, which helps to offset that circular or concentric patterning on those sunken subdials, with the small seconds placed at 6 o'clock and the date cut out from that. And the dial is, whilst somewhat cluttered I think due to those large subdials, very, very well balanced, and I think works very well with this design to give something which does appear a little bit more masculine than the standard Santos. To match these new changes to the watch, one has 100 meter water resistance, and of course the very clever bracelet design, which means that it can be removed from the watch and replaced with a strap, or adjusted in terms of length without using any sort of tools to unscrew the links, but rather simply to push buttons in the back of the bracelet and to release it. And I think this provides a very interesting and very clever solution to what is conventionally a bit of a pain if you have a bracelet with particularly difficult links to size. The automatic caliber 1904 CHMC inside this watch also provides an interesting new direction for this watch, because you'll notice the pushers aren't in the conventional places. Because this 48-hour power reserve automatic 4Hz chronograph with 35 joules has a unique setup for the placement of the pushers, and this means that one has a rectangular pusher on the left-hand side of the case to start and stop the chronograph, and then one simply presses the crown of the watch to reset it, which is a very interesting configuration and rather an interesting way of demonstrating a chronograph function on a watch of this style, but without losing any of that beautiful design to the addition of pushers on the one side of the case. And the price for this watch will vary between $8,950 and $24,700. This year from Audemars Piguet we've seen quite a few very interesting releases, including some rather controversial ones which I'll address in the dress watch video. But when speaking about models in this casual and sports watch category, really I think there's no better watch to speak about than the new Royal Oak Selfwinding 41mm. And I think I should note that this isn't the jumbo version, as has been pointed out by others. This is the standard Royal Oak, the most commonly purchased one, and the most popular one. And they have also released a new chronograph at the 38mm size, but I feel this piece in 41mm is more important to speak about, because it will be the main force of Royal Oak sales. And this is the reference 15500, which replaces the 15400 which came out in 2012. And this piece has a 41mm by 10.4mm thick case, making it a very reasonable size for general wear, and of course fits the mould of the Royal Oak as that balance between sporting design and also the classic charm of a dress watch. And the piece comes either in stainless steel or rose gold, with a blue, a black or a grey dial, depending upon what you fancy, with that tapisserie form where it's turned and engraved in this way to create this patterning. And this has a few very major changes over its predecessor, the 15400, because that didn't use an in-house caliber. It used the caliber 3120, which was brought in, whereas this now uses a caliber which has been brought out with their new line of dress watches. And this is the caliber 4302, which is a new in-house automatic caliber with a 70-hour power reserve that runs at 4 Hz, a higher beat rate to previously seen models on this watch, as well as having 32 joules and being automatic. And so it's really an appropriate movement to put into this watch, and I think is a very good choice for AP to include this in their new line. Now, it should also be noted this keeps the same 5 atmosphere water resistance, but really where the design of this watch is concerned, everything has been tweaked, from the crown being a little bit narrower and also a slightly different shape, to the dial being fundamentally redesigned with a larger AP logo, broadened indices and broadened hands, but shortened indices as well to create a more stout form to the dial and a more modern appearance. Also, the date has been moved further out to the edge of the dial, and you'll notice the rim of the dial doesn't feature that texturing to create this interesting decoration. And I must say, I think this is a very, very well designed and very well conceived update, also by removing the automatic signature on the bottom half of the dial. And in all of its configurations, I'm certain this piece will do extremely well, as indeed the Royal Oak is, irrespective of whether people want to complain about it being somewhat overseen, is very much a design classic. And I think in the industry, if a watch is able to rise to that sort of level, then a brand certainly does have to lean on it. And I do think that AP have lent on the Royal Oak perhaps a little bit too much in recent years, but I think considering how incredibly good a design it is, I can certainly understand them wanting to update it to modern standards, and certainly the addition of a more modern movement is a very welcome addition. The price of this watch ranges between $19,200 up to $50,500. Now, the penultimate model I like to speak about is from Montblanc, And Montblanc are a brand which has been progressing extremely well in terms of developments and new items in their collection, but also in terms of movements and designs in recent years. And this piece, which is the Heritage Pulsograph, is a very interesting demonstration of this. And this model takes inspiration from much older pieces, and I think combines them very, very well with this salmon dial chronograph with classic charm and appeal and a thoroughly beautiful movement. And I was reluctant to put this into my sports watch and casual watch video, but I think by comparison to the watches which I'd like to speak about in my dress watch video, this watch very much does fall on this side of things. And this piece is a 40mm stainless steel chronograph with a boxed sapphire crystal and a 5 ATM water resistance. But really it's the dial and the movement which have caught my eye with this piece, because this model features this rather wonderful salmon dial with both sunburst and matted effects built into it, with the old Montblanc logo, which is, I think, more elegant than modern interpretations, with Heritage Pulsograph as well on the dial, and Swiss made. And the centre of the dial appears very cleanly done with that sunburst effect, and those two subdials which fit extremely neatly into that central section of the dial. And then one has these beautiful anthracite elements on the hands, those Dauphine hands, as well as on the implied indices and numerals, and then one that's offset by the blued hands for the chronograph and the running seconds, as well as the blued elements on the dial for the pulsation markers which allow you to take your pulse, in addition to the standard graduations for the chronograph which are set into the dial rather than running right around the edge. The element of this watch, though, which I think is most beautiful, and perhaps most traditional in a general sense in terms of its detailing, is the movement. And for this watch they've chosen the in-house developed MBM13.21, which is a rather curious movement which takes on from the movements developed by Minerva in the early 20th century. And so this movement is based on the Minerva 1320 from the 1920s, and thus represents a very, very interesting element to the Montblanc range, because it is a thoroughly beautiful movement of that period, and does have that exposed gear train that you see in watches of this period with that lateral clutch, which you see moving across to engage and disengage the chronograph, which is commonly accepted as one of the most beautiful elements of a chronograph, especially a manually wound one, because you don't have an automatic module which would obstruct the view. And where operation is concerned, this movement is charismatically old school, and I say this in the sense that it is very visible in terms of the amount of detailing you see. One can see perlage on certain elements, very attractively beveled edges, and generally extremely beautifully done finishing throughout, with golden text of Minerva on some of the bridges, as well as some elements which are stylised. And one can also see the column wheel placed on the one side of the movement, which provides that crisp engagement to the chronograph, as is also seen with the use of that lateral clutch. But in terms of detailing, one also has to look at the balance, which has this swan neck regulation, in addition to having a weighted balance wheel, which allows more accurate time setting, and also more reliable timekeeping once it's set. But in terms of its specifications, as I've said, it is quite old school, so it runs at 18,000 vibrations per hour, which is a tad slow by modern standards in terms of the number of ticks a second, but I think it does appear very charismatic due to that slow tick, which just gives a certain je ne sais quoi to this watch. It does also have a relatively long power reserve of 55 hours, which will be helpful for owners, and with 22 jewels and 239 parts, it's a thoroughly complex movement with that monopusher operation. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a watch of this calibre in terms of its detailing and its finishing, the price for this watch is very much into the high-end luxury realms of €28,000. But with 100 pieces being made, I'm certain these pieces will sell extremely well, and I think their beauty really makes Montblanc an interesting brand to follow. And the reason why I say this, in fact one of the reasons why I featured this watch, is because it is a slightly alternative piece, but I think it demonstrates a side to Montblanc which really can't be scoffed at. And I think very often people dismiss Montblanc as a pen maker, but I think in this regard Montblanc really have excelled, and with some of their other pieces released at SIHH this year, I think the following year and years to come look very bright for Montblanc. Now the final piece I'd like to speak about really does hit the nail on the head for the ultimate luxury sports watch. And I say this in the sense of a watch which can be worn every day, whether you're enjoying the watch formally at a board meeting or simply in your own private life. And this is the Vacheron Constantin Overseas Tourbillon. And whilst we've seen incremental changes in other models in the Overseas line, and we've also seen a new pink, gold and full bracelet version of the perpetual calendar, this piece represents a whole new departure for this model. And having handled a piece in the Vacheron Constantin line which also included this movement, I can say it really is a thing to behold. But the general build of the watch is a 42.5mm by 10.39mm sports watch with a 50m water resistance, and design which is both contemporary and quintessentially Vacheron Constantin. And I think this plays off against models such as the benchmark of this sort of area of watchmaking, the Patek Philippe Nautilus, extremely well. This provides a case which is perhaps a bit more slender, a bit more understated, but with an incredible movement and characteristic design which doesn't appear derivative in the slightest. And one sees the elements of the Maltese cross seen on the logo of Vacheron Constantin throughout this model, whether one sees it on the bezel or indeed in the links of the bracelet. One also sees extremely fine brushing down the length of the case and the bracelet, in addition to these beautiful fine polished bevels within the lines of the bracelet and along the edges of the case and on that bezel. The crown is unguarded but also similarly beautifully detailed, and one sees this sapphire crystal on the front, covering the dial, which is elegant, understated, but also very well detailed with a sunburst effect in blue, in addition to some printed elements and the applied Vacheron Constantin logo with these applied luminous indices and matching luminous hands. Naturally, those indices are white gold, but rather curiously, the case is steel on this watch, which I really appreciate, and whilst that may seem ridiculous for a watch which costs $103,000, I must say I think it's reasonable, because one often sees extremely heavily embellished models from individual brands' ranges, which cost this sort of price, and so to see a brand which is willing to recognise that this watch is, for some owners with admittedly incredibly deep pockets, going to be worn on a regular basis, gives a certain understated charm to this watch as something where all the technology and time has gone into the movement and the finishing of the case rather than sheer materials. And naturally this brings me to the centrepiece of the dial, the skeletonized tourbillon sitting just at the 6 o'clock position and fitted beautifully between 6 o'clock and the centre of the dial. And the detailing here is wonderful, with the Maltese cross again rendered in the cage of the tourbillon, in addition to having a single blued screw on one corner of that, which represents the second hand, and so one sees graduations on that beveled edge around the inside of the dial. But really it's when one turns the watch over that one sees the engineering. And turning the watch over, one sees this magnificent view of the caliber 2160, a tourbillon movement with that skeletonized tourbillon at the 6 o'clock position, and of course the thoroughly beautiful decoration on the caseback with Geneva striping, in addition to very exposed gear trains, so one can see the individual parts at work, with separate bridges screwed in rather than having a single plate, which gives a really beautiful view, and I think makes this watch all the more worthwhile as a piece to simply behold. And of course, looking at the back, one can also see the automatic winding, because this watch has a very interesting solution to automatic winding with a peripheral rotor, and that means this golden rotor rotates around the sides of the movement rather than being attached in the centre, which means that you can get this fantastic view and the watch can be significantly slimmer. And of course the watch does have the Geneva seal, in addition to running at 18,000 vibrations per hour, which again is a somewhat slow rate, but it does mean that then the tourbillon can rotate once a minute, giving you that second hand, and the watch has also the additional function of an 80-hour power reserve, making it very wearable, although I must admit the usability seems somewhat abstract when spending this sort of amount of money on watches. But certainly I think it's a wonderful piece and an interesting place to end this video. And so I'll conclude the video there, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this video and of these sports watches and my choices for the sports watches released at SIHH. And do tell me in the comments down below if there's anything that you would have preferred me to speak about, or indeed any pieces which you were pleased to hear about, because I'm always curious to hear what has caught your interest, because it's such a personal choice picking a few watches to speak about, because it simply isn't possible to cover everything released. And do keep an eye on my channel over the next while, whilst I release the second video in this series of SIHH, so speaking about the dress watches, which are always the predominant side of this show by contrast to Baselworld, which tends to be a rough average of both. And so if you did enjoy the video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, out.